Thank you, Culture Academy, and the many people that organized this event. And thank you all for coming. I'm honored and humbled to be here. Welcome to my world. Last summer, a major international corporation in the virtual reality space started a new accelerator in San Francisco. And this is from their online application. And the guy running the show is a buddy of mine. And I pinged him and said, I love you, but this is a little pathetic. And he thanked me, and a couple of days later changed it to this. So it's better, right? But it still reflects a rather innocent perspective about time frame. So I'd like to share several time frames with you in which I've had the good fortune to participate. Oops. And sometimes going back quite far. And the intention is not sentimentality, and it's not even really academic, but hopefully to provide some practical, solid, usable insights about the complex dynamics between technology and content. And the goal is to look at the trajectories more than any individual dots on the timeline. So here are the dynamics and the time frames that I'd like to share. And there's lots to show, so let's get started. So I'd like to start with the history of art at MIT, the 69-year history I'm going to do in 5 minutes. And the reason I think this is interesting is because what happened at MIT in the arts presaged what happened everywhere else. And the story begins with Gyuri Kepes, a Hungarian who immigrated with Moholy-Nagy from the Bauhaus to Chicago after World War II and was hired by MIT in 1947. He was the first artist professor there. I had the great pleasure of knowing him until he died in 2001. 10 years later, in 2011, I was at MIT as visiting faculty, partly to continue my own work, but also to understand the dynamics between art and research and art and invention. Around this time, Kepes was making a comeback of sorts. This is from late 2010. And Hans-Ulrich Obrist writes, Kepes was a great inspiration. He had a holistic approach to knowledge, and the links he made between art, design, and other disciplines, especially science, are so important now. So I used this opportunity to dive into his remarkable series of books that began in 1951 based on an exhibition that he curated at MIT, which by all accounts was just absolutely extraordinary. Works of art and science stood side by side and matched. This is very new at the time. And then in 1965 and 1966, he edited an insanely ambitious number of books. And as he wrote, to stimulate the circulation of ideas, to find the channels of communication that interconnect various disciplines and offer us a sense of structure in our 20th century world. And significantly, several years later, a 7th book. So what I've done here is go through the books and highlighted all of the authors who currently have Wikipedia entries. And very sadly, so few women were included in his editions. On the one hand, history is harsh. On the other hand, this has proven to be an extraordinary collection of creative talent. And I'm going to go through these quickly. It'll be posted on my website if anyone's further interested. Buckminster Fuller, John Cage, Marshall McLuhan, Abraham Maslow. And then 7 years later, a final edition, which was more politicized, particularly around the critical role of the artist. So here's a timeline, and you don't have to read this all, but what I would like to point out is that there are three epochs that are roughly 30 years apart. And in 1981, I was there during that moment. And though I was young, I was perhaps one of the most people caught in the middle between two different groups, one which became the Media Lab and the other which was Kepish's Art Center. And that set this 30-year trajectory of two different approaches to art, to tech-based art in particular. And it was just a few years ago in 2010 that these two groups that had been for 30 years on opposite sides of the campus moved in the same building. And these are quotes taken from their own literature. And again, I'm showing you this because what happened at MIT during these first two 30-year epochs presaged what happened everywhere else in the world. And this big picture stuff is not just me. This is literally from last year. And Nicholas Negroponte being quoted as, when I think back to the influence on me, it was to think big and simple at the same time. So here we are. We have the Media Lab style enthusiasm. We have the program for art, culture, and technology style criticality. And I might interject that artist Joan Jonas and I had an internal joke when I was there that enthusiasm and criticality loosely translate into happy art and angry art. And it's the stuff that Kepish was advocating, the holistic approach, making links, which was the root of these other two approaches that maybe we could do a little better at. So some brief observations. Criticality isn't big in Silicon Valley or startup culture in general. It's often viewed as pessimism, as a bummer. But when you look at some of the blunders that these very big companies made, you have to think that it would have been better to have criticality on the inside rather than wait for it to get out for public criticism. So much of my time and attention is spent on being critical in a positive and trusting way. Okay, here's a very early example of what today is called projection mapping. This is from the 2005 installation. It's called Displacements, and I hope what you can see is that it's a room with a projector, motion picture projector going around, where everything had been filmed and then spray painted white, except the people, of course. So the people come out very ghost-like. The stuff comes out very, very real, except stuff that's moved. And it was called Displacements because the artifacts of the moving things in and out of registration were at least as interesting as the very real-looking projection mapping. By the way, folks like me make installations like this to get people to see them in actuality. So you're seeing a second-order representation of it. Okay, here's an example several years later out in the field working with the UNESCO World Heritage Center. Do we have volume? Thank you. And we can keep it kind of muted. The idea was to go to 4 UNESCO World Heritage and Danger sites, find one spot that was panoramically interesting, work with locals, and shoot several different times of day. Like here's Jerusalem, if you look carefully. Perfectly registered different times of day, and give the viewers a highly immersive experience we shot in stereo by having the image appear to rotate around them. Back then, it was really hard to have a projector that wide to do that, so we rotated the audience, and this is with the curtain down. But trust me, that feeling when you're on a train in the station and the train next to you pulls out and you think that you're moving? Almost everybody will very quickly feel like this image is rotating around you. And the goal was to get a visceral feeling of being there. So that worked not so bad. It took another half dozen years after the actual shooting to reflect on what could be done with a stationary image, stationary camera. And here's some very simple studies. So this one, for example, takes nothing more than 2 images in a tripod and a little bit of Photoshop. People think there's more going on here. And this to me has huge implications for the DIY community. Doing things that appear much more than they are with very simple means. This is the same footage in Timbuktu, offset in registration. So if you look at the background buildings, some of which don't exist today, tragically, the registration works, but if you look at things that move, like here in Jerusalem, the security truck at the right, that several seconds later it'll appear again. Was that wanted? Well, not particularly, but again, this was the equivalent of shooting with 3 cameras by only shooting with 1. And here's 3 different times of day in registration in Dubrovnik. So if you look, it's spatially registered, but temporally, the shadows are off, but there's still some kind of sense of place, albeit in an abstracted way. And here's the flip side of that. This is sunrise in Angkor. Sunrise in Jerusalem. And sunrise in Timbuktu. So these images are temporally contiguous or consistent and spatially different. And just for what it's worth, you'll now see the shadow of the camera 180 degrees off moving. So it took another half dozen years for 3D televisions to appear to actually realize that. And I was at USC at the time, and we, again, made a half hexagon, 180-degree view. And this is all in stereo, 3D. So it more or less works. And again, a very efficient, relatively inexpensive way of shooting immersively. So another 7 years pass, and last summer I was invited to be Google's first resident artist in their brand new VR division. And what I'm about to show you now, we recently published just a couple months ago on medium.com, including lots of videos. So I'm just going to do an overview here. We took the Google GoPro virtual reality stereo panoramic video camera, and we taped off an area. And the joke was, while everybody else is flying off in VR to shoot Timbuktu, I've already done that. So I'm good shooting literally in Google's backyard. And these studies were to explore how people are represented in VR and to make some, modest but hopefully solid headway on some very fundamental issues. So the images on the left here, and again, these are all on video on Medium, are the full 360-degree representation, and on the right are what a viewer would see in virtual reality. So for example, the bottom left-hand image, the 2 gentlemen are standing opposite each other with the camera in the middle. So we learned about such things as close-ups and artifacts, about limits of recognizability, because in VR you can't zoom, you're only where the camera is, about camera height and eye line, and it's a joy to do stuff like this where things that you think are going to work don't, and you actually learn something, about dialogue and positioning, and about how to digitally add subjects, and for that matter, subtract crew. Because what most people are doing in VR today, from a crew's point of view, is turn the camera on and hide, behind a tree or something. So here's one little example.
Okay, 2 more lines.
All right.
And this you can direct right into the camera.
Okay.
Can you say the line, a pocket full of posies? And I'll give it to you here.
A pocket full of posies.
Brilliant. Then if you don't mind, we have everybody sort of drop to the ground.
Okay.
You can do sort of a pratfall.
All right.
However you feel comfortable doing it.
Sure.
And I'll give you the gesture. And
A ring around the rosy.
A pocket
full of posies.
Ashes. Ashes.
We all
fall down.
So it's a hyperimage. It's a word we like to use for these artificially overpopulated things, which I think work particularly well in virtual reality. And it's a credible one in that if you think the shadows don't look right, they actually are. Again, remember, this is a 360-degree representation. And Jim, the sound guy, disappeared. We digitally composited him out. All the subjects were mic'd separately, and a pro-level spatial sound mix was done in post-production. And the subjects all shot separately appear synchronized in both words and action. So imagine what you can do with that. And we can push it further to incredible hyperimages.
Don't be evil.
And of course, something like this took about 5 minutes to shoot, right? Because we had her walk up progressively along the 12-hour radials. And an inspiration for this kind of hyperreal imagery comes from artists like Bruegel. This is from 1560. So some brief observations here. I had a boss once in a research lab where I was working on an immersion project and mentioned that I was going to slow down the imagery and to half speed. And he looked at me in shock, like I was doing something wrong. He said, "But Michael, they'll be moving in slow motion," as if there was something really wrong about that. And it's important to recognize this distinction, and it really falls in a funny way around the word artifact. Because in culture, artifact is considered a good word. It's sort of, the hand, use of the hand. In technology, it's considered that which you want to get rid of when you go to conferences like Computer Vision or Computer Graphics Conference. And in VR, the whole artifacts question is huge, dealing with things like resolution and field of view and image lag. So I just want to point this out as something fundamental, perhaps, as a difference between art and science. We all recognize these. It's a Google Street View camera car, that records panoramic images at regular distance intervals. Here's a car from 1978, which recorded panoramic images at regular distance intervals from an MIT project called the Aspen Movie Map, and the brown blob of hair with a white jacket on top is me. And the bicycle wheel on the back is lowered and hooked up to the cameras on top that were stop frame cameras to trigger them, and as a result you get something like this. So the look, it's not still photography, it's not cinema motion pictures, it's not computer graphics, and this look has the look that it does because of this equal distance triggering, in this case 1 frame every 10 feet, going down every street and turning through every intersection every possible way. And I would argue that this is its own genre. And perhaps more than anyone else, I kept at it for a bunch of years. So this is in Paris, working for the RATP, the Paris Metro, in 1986, with an electric car stop frame camera triggered by the encoder on the axle. And yes, that is a mime. We hired a mime to see if we could add a cinematic visual continuity. And the Paris Metro commissioned it to see if it could help people find their way around using images only. Several years later, here's a project for San Francisco's Exploratorium, and that off the helicopter is a large, very expensive motion picture gyro stabilizer. And it's, by the way, noteworthy that a replacement for that fits in the palm of your hand today. So the intention here was not to simulate a helicopter ride, but to give users, again, a hyperreal experience, more like Superman or Superwoman, like this, something that you can't have in the real world. Several years later, here's a project for ZKM, Center for Arts and Media in Karlsruhe. Karlsruhe is very proud of their tram system, which goes out to the Black Forest, and we worked with them and hooked a stop frame camera up to the odometer. And this was an opportunity to have the scale of the projection be what we call orthoscopically correct, so that the scale is right. And when you're standing there, it feels like a giant window. And again, the imagery maybe looks a little computer graphics, but it's the stop frame unique look that we have with this sort of genre. So in 2009, the ZKM reshot everything for a then and now installation. They're giving me too much credit here. It's noteworthy excuse me, that Germany has been the most defiant country regarding Google Street View, and over 200,000 people opted out of showing their homes. But we had no problems in Karlsruhe doing this as an art project, and I suppose there's a lesson there. Several years later, a project for the Banff Centre for the Arts in Canada. And this was the first time I had the opportunity to use two cameras, left eye, right eye, for stereo. And for a bunch of historic and cultural and aesthetic reasons, we packaged it to look like a turn of the previous century's kinetoscope. And you turned the crank, and it had a similar interface to the Golden Gate project, where you felt tightly connected with the footage. So turning the crank, you can go forward and backward. And often, if you like, at unreal, at hyperreal speeds. So at this point, after doing the stuff for 15 years, I stopped. I concluded it was a dumb idea. Artists always have a problem with timing, I'll tell you. Excuse me. And that what was really needed was not these sort of video images, but real 3D models. And here's some early research that was fueled by our footage. These are all from a single stereo pair. And you'll notice that the two names, the third and fourth name, are Paul Debevic and Leo Villarreal, who were interns of mine at the time. Paul was a budding computer scientist, and Leo was a budding artist. And this is kind of a digression, but I couldn't help putting this in. Paul scanned President Obama a couple of years ago using a light stage, which is what he called the device he built. And Leo did this incredible project in San Francisco called the Bay Lights Project. Here's a USC project that I'll go through very quickly. That was an art and research project that allows people to situate their own photos inside Google Earth, and like at the time Flickr. And the intention was to combine the folksonomic free-for-all, folksonomy, wonderful word, bottom-up organization, that Flickr or now Instagram or Snapchat has with a visceral VR feeling of flying around the world. And doing something like this not only allows the use of any current photo, but also historical photos. So some brief observations here. Travel and tourism employs something like 10% of the global workforce. The question of who's in control, quite literally producers or participants, will ultimately determine whether special places stay special. And whatever the process, it certainly has something to do with long-term versus short-term priorities, and this is where the culture community can play a huge role. So finally, this is among the most ambitious and haunting projects in new media that I've ever seen, and largely due to the relentless work of ethnomusicologist Alan Lomax. And I had the privilege and honor of working with him through the 90s before he died, more as a cheerleader. I helped him get some funding from Apple and Interval. And it's a big story. It begins literally in the 1860s in central Texas, where one John Lomax grew up. And it was cowboy country, like cowboys, cows. And they followed the river valley near his home. He heard their folk songs. He grew up to become an early folklorist. And by the 1920s, made some of the world's first field audio recordings with his teenage son, Alan Lomax, assisting. This is verifiably true in terms of the first because they were given a recorder by Thomas Edison's widow, and they made it portable. It weighed 500 pounds, and this was the basis for the U.S. Library of Congress archive. Allen continued for decades in other countries. Other people were sending recordings to him, thousands, and Allen thought he heard patterns. Here he is in 1941 transcribing folk songs with Jerry Wiesner, the guy in the background, later became John F. Kennedy's science advisor, then the president of MIT, and then the co-founder of the Media Lab, Small World. In the early 60s, Allen was working at Columbia University in New York and began serious research called cantometrics, and later for dance choreometrics. For cantometrics, they found 37 parameters made to represent world music, and they were firm about that. It had to include glottal stops and rasps and things outside of Western music, but they had to code everything manually and then look for statistical correlation. But he also felt that he heard larger correlations, like between Central Africa and Georgia and Russia, the music is statistically similar, between Inuit and Patagonia. And correlations don't mean causality, but this fits in with our view of evolution today, and it's pretty strong, romantic, provocative stuff. Around the same time, there were other anthropologists coding all of culture, mostly village culture. And the Lomax team could cross-correlate their dance and music work with this. And they found even more haunting stuff, like cultures that have lateral knee movement in their dance styles correlate with cultures that were early adopters of potter wheels, and cultures with narrow heel-to-toe dance correlate with cultures whose principal crops are planted in narrow rows, like rice. So this is a 1992 video.
Database here. These are excerpts of film from ethnographic filmmakers and travelers from all kinds of archives in Germany and Bulgaria. And this is what we have coded, which you might call a mini Library of Congress. We have almost all the important types of American folk music covered here.
Do you know how many hours are here?
Well, about 5,000 tapes. It wouldn't be possible without these new techniques, because we wouldn't know. We wouldn't be able to find the woods for the trees. But now it's as clear as a bell to me, the whole story. So I can now give that back.
And it really was clear as a bell to him. He honestly believed that culture carried as much resilience as genes. And we produced his first and only demo. It's very late 90s, Hypercard. You can find this on YouTube. And then Allen died in 2002, and his daughter Anna Lomax Wood is now running the show. And another 9 years pass, and then some news. In 2011, a 400-page book on Allen's life came out. And as it says, he really did inspire musicians. He's generally credited as the discoverer of Huddie Leadbelly, Jelly Roll Morton, Woody Guthrie. Bob Dylan crashed in his apartment when he first got to New York. He worked in the Library of Congress with Pete Seeger's parents and watched him grow up. And Lomax had a popular music show in the 50s on BBC, which was listened to by Lennon, McCarthy, Townsend, and Clapton. And the Rolling Stones literally took the name of their band from a song they heard on Alan Lomax's radio broadcast. They started putting everything freely online in 2012, and then the press started actually adopting the phrase global jukebox, so they got some exposure. Little has changed, though, and they're still struggling financially. And I got to say, this was the coolest project I ever saw then, and it still is now in many ways. And if you think Pandora, but with a connection back to place, everybody has roots, and our roots are getting more complex because as people move to cities and urbanization. So in addition to the joy of culture, to me, this project represents a strong ecological message as well. This is from a couple years using his celebrity friends to raise some money. They raised a little bit. This is more recent work, definitely more sophisticated, but they're still struggling to get by. They had a Kickstarter campaign a couple years ago. They raised it, but not much. This is an excerpt from the 2011 book on the global jukebox, where the author credits Alan Lomax with conceiving first of metadata, folksonomy, and they gave me the last non-Alan Lomax quote in the book. I'll read it briefly. The global jukebox has fallen into an abyss between academic and pop culture, between world-saving and money-making, and between content and technology. And in the new media industry, the technology folks seem to drive content rather than the other way around. It's too bad, since most of the planet's cultures have the content but not the technology. Alan's biggest fear was hegemony, and how to convince young people in villages before moving to urban places that the music and dance and cooking recipes of their grandparents had value and that the loss would be ours. So some brief observations here. So who drives technology and who drives content? The Lomax lesson may be that you, the cultural communities, lose. That, as noted, the technology folks seem to drive content rather than the other way around. So are we doomed to these powerful new tools being driven mostly by young, mostly male, mostly privileged engineers who don't really represent anyone? My answer may have recently changed. The role of these powerful new tools in the recent US presidential elections has brought a new and very, very deep and intense level of soul searching around Silicon Valley, the likes of which I've never seen. And that maybe longer term, more holistic perspectives are needed. So this might be your moment. Thank you.